Welcome, this is a video for the Year 7 Pop-It unit of work, and we're going to be comparing two artists from the pop art movement, Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein. So just looking at our previous knowledge here before we go any further, we know from learning about the cultural frame that artists represent ideas from the world around them at the time they are making their artworks. And we also know from watching those videos at the start of this unit that the pop art movement was all about representing the exciting changes that were happening in the world and society, in particular in the US. And there was an obsession in pop art with mass production, advertising, and celebrities. And the artists at this time were really asking this question, what is art? And really challenging people's perceptions of what artworks were. While we look at two artworks from these artists, I also want you to be remembering the elements of design. So these are the tools that artists use to make art. So this is the sort of thing that we use when we are talking about artworks through the structural frame, but I just want you to bear these in the back of your mind. So the elements of design: line, shape, form, color, texture, space. These are the things that artists use to make their works. So I want you to try and pay attention to which of these you can see in the two artworks that we look at next. So we're going to start with Andy Warhol. This is a screen printing called Liz No. 5, Early Coloured Liz. And this is a portrait of a very famous actress at the time named Elizabeth Taylor. So we know a little bit about Warhol already. We know that he was obsessed with representing images of famous people, images of mass-produced items. He really embraced the process of screen printing his work because he was also obsessed with the idea of repetition that's related to mass production. And in the process of repeating his images over and over, he embraced the imperfections that made them unique. But at the end of the day, screen printing really rendered his images more or less meaningless because as he repeated it over and over, they lost their sense of being unique and being individual. So that's Andy Warhol. This one is Roy Lichtenstein and it's called Oh Alright. And you can see immediately that it's a very different style of work. So this is a painting and in the background, which you can't see too well in this reproduction, the background is made up of a series of dots. So Roy Lichtenstein really embraced this idea of advertising and comic strips in his work. So the advertising influence can be seen in the dots there. So what he's done is he's actually painted this canvas with a series of what we call Band-Aid dots, which is the way that images in newspapers were coloured. And we can definitely see that influence of comic strips and cartoons as well with the way that he has outlined his image. This is not a picture of a real person. This is definitely a rendered image, and it's a painted image, and it's very unrealistic, but we can still recognize a portrait and a woman's face here. The other thing that Lichtenstein did in a lot of his work is he included text, he included speech bubbles or captions, and by doing so he gives us a bit of a narrative in his work as well. So this is where we might use the subjective frame, because we know the subjective frame is all about audiences' reactions and the emotional response to things, and part of that is us filling in the blanks on this narrative. So as we look at this work and we read the words "oh, alright," and we see that she's on the phone, we're actually invited as the audience to fill the gaps there, and we're creating a bit of a narrative in our head about what's happening, and that's something that we're going to look at in more detail later in this unit of work. So we're going to compare these two images, these two portraits, and when you look at them side by side, you can see that they are both very, very different, but there's also certain similarities that link them as pop artists and pop artworks. And we're going to look at three distinct things. So we're looking at subject matter, artistic intentions, and the style and visual features. So Subject matter is obviously very simple. They're both portraits, but one is realistic, or at least using a real image, and the other is quite unrealistic, what we call stylized, the way that it has been painted and outlined and the unrealistic colours that are used. So they're very, very different in style, but they're both the same subject. Artworks represent the artist's intention. Warhol was very obsessed with famous people, repetition, imperfections. Here we've got a portrait of a famous person. We've got it screen printed, which suggests that he could make as many of these as he wanted without very much effort. And we've got the imperfections in this image as well, because the colours don't quite line up, they're not quite realistic. You know, those lips are very large, her hair is sort of disappearing at the top there. The shadows around her eyes and her face are quite imperfect because the image has degraded from taking it from a newspaper. Whereas with Lichtenstein, we have said that he is obsessed with this imagery from advertising, from comic strips, and using narrative in his work as well. So the way that he has made his work represents those intentions. His use of dots, his use of outlines, his use of text all tell us that that is what he's interested in showing us from this particular period of time. And so when we put all of this together and we look at the style that these artists have used and the visual features of his work, this is where we're using our structural frame, and we're looking at the colours that have been used, the use of lines and shapes, and also the composition. So all of these things are linked to the materials that the artist has used. So one artist has used screen printing and one has used painting. So very different mediums mean that the stylistic features, visual features, are going to be quite different. So for instance, if we look at the screen printing on the left-hand side, that is very shape-driven because we've got these really, really dark black shadows and black shapes that have been placed over the top of the colours, and we're not really seeing any lines here. We're seeing really bold, filled-in shapes that make up the image. Whereas if we look at Lichtenstein's painting on the right, it's very line-driven. We see lots and lots of outlines. We see lines of different thicknesses and different directions. And so the image is formed through the use of line more than the use of shape. Composition as well, looking at the way that the artist has laid out these works, there's very, very little extraneous detail. There's nothing in the background. It's a really close-up shot of both of the portraits' faces. So we're really, really asked to look very, very closely at their faces. And if you imagine someone standing that close to you, where all you can see is their face and part of their neck and maybe a little bit of their shoulders, they would be standing very, very close, and that's very can be quite confronting, or it can be quite intimate. So the use of composition also changes the way that we look at these images because they feel very close to us. So looking at the different materials that they've used helps us to understand the way that their style is, and by looking at the style and the subject matter, we understand what the artists are trying to represent here. So Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein were both interested in changing the way people understood portraiture. So looking at these two artworks together, the choices that they make really, really change the outcome of the artworks and really change the way that they are understood and they are read by people. So if we were living at the time that these artworks were produced, we would immediately recognise Elizabeth Taylor in this portrait on the left, and we would immediately recognise this comic style, advertising style of the right. So we have to look at this through the lens of history, looking back in time, and an awareness of what artists were trying to do, and the influences on these artists helps us to understand these works and to gain another level of appreciation for them. Hopefully by watching this video, you've gained an understanding of the way we can use the frames to understand artworks. The cultural frame helps us to understand the artist's intentions, and the structural frame helps us to link those intentions with the visual features of an artwork and the way that it has been made.